Wonder what's happening.
Yeah, I don't know. The partisan is in the room.
Maybe some technical issues.
Yeah, it happens.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah.
Now.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Pat.
Everyone, I have to begin some gratitude. First, Chief Oyibo, my thanks to your pastor for agreeing to finish early today.
I left him before he finished.
Oh, you left before he finished?
Yes, exactly. Because I'm in Port Harcourt and the service starts later, 10:30, and they have many things.
Yes, you said so.
Yes.
Right. No, but you see, we did you a good turn by making you leave early. If not, all those people who will surround you after church, you'd have spent more money than you planned.
No, they threatened to come to my office tomorrow. Okay.
Okay.
Have we lost him again?
He's there. Okay,
yes,
now
is there.
Okay, Pat, start us off now.
His screen is frozen. Lost him.
Maybe it's network.
I think I am within a voice contact again. All right. Thank you. I think all is said. Good afternoon, very distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor and a privilege once more to be able to initiate another set of conversations around the policy history of our country, the choices that we made yesterday, and how we can essentially reflect on those policies for the benefit of the next set of policymakers that our country will have, so that they will have the benefit of the privilege of growth from yesterday's mistakes and learning from yesterday's good judgments. We have, in the last couple of months, surveyed different aspects of Nigerian life, Nigerian economy in particular. We concluded 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago the series on manufacturing in Nigeria. And just before that, we had a series on healthcare in Nigeria. And just before that, we had an education, and then so on and so forth. The great fulfillment for me personally through this series is that we've had many people who were involved in decision making on health. We had at least 6 or 7 former health ministers, and so on and so forth. And their reflections are enormously valuable, because it seems to me like many of those who were involved in policy making evidently thought that most of the appropriate inputs were made, but a variety of reasons prevented them from going as they should go. Perhaps if we can manage to identify all of those, the next generation of policymakers may move our country in a direction that spares it some of the of yesterday. Last a fortnight ago, we started the series oil and gas. We had the good fortune of having with us Izoma Philip Asiodu. We had with us Dr. Imo Itsweli. We had with us Dr. Idemudia. Some who are with us today got into the conversation. Dr. Gaswili Hetu made some really interesting contributions to that conversation. Today we move into gas. Gas has always had a special place in my heart. In some ways, I used to joke that part of my claim to fame was I talked so much about which I knew nothing about. Back in the days that we used to have it of a group called the Association of Concerned Economists. We used to have these meetings first in Moses Tiger's office, then in the late chief, and so when Chief Medamosi led to the as we said at that time, responsible for planning, but had the
we switch off the screen?
Duty to lead the Nigerian delegation to OPEC. He got to a point where Chief, because those were the years of struggle with oil prices. And as I remarked actually, Chief Badamosi was at a point where he was watching his Indonesian and the Indonesian counterpart kept people were fighting and struggling, and he thought that was very peculiar. And so during the week, he went to the Indonesian chap and said to him, "Look, why are you so uninterested? You don't need quota." He said the Indonesian guy smiled at him and said, "Well, it's you Nigerians. Well, we're depending more on gas, and that has no quota." And as what he said to me, the moment he said that, the one word that came out of his mouth was "part." So I thought it became my claim to fame. And once he returned to Nigeria, he quickly called me and said, "Now I get it." So gas time, and also everybody, almost a whole generation made the point that I think that the structure of the Nigeria LNG is the way we should have gone all through. But we have people who know much, much better than me today, and I'm glad that they can throw light on this. We are honored and we are privileged to have today in the planning, and really we have with us Dr. Gaswili Hetu, who was managing director of the Nigeria LNG when many of the challenges were faced. We have with us Mr. Babs Omotoa, who was managing director of the Nigeria LNG or the NLNG more lately, and who have just enjoyed reading his autobiography that gave some insights into some of the challenges that he had to deal with at the NLNG, the importance of integrity and choice in those kinds of situations. And then, of course, we have the grand baba of the whole matter, Chief Chamberlain Oyibo, who was Group Managing Director of the the NMPC. As a good friend of his said to me, Chief Oyibo knows where all the bodies are buried. So today we will find out. But let me please begin with Charles, because planning matters. Engineer Sensua, like I said, was at the planning stage of what became. And we had Izoma PCS Yodu say last week that it was really about planning, and all the great ideas and the plans were made, but somehow somebody said planning didn't matter anymore, and we began to fumble and stumble from there. So Charles, please, could you sketch the terrain for us? We always talk about how Nigeria is a gas country with associated crude oil, but somehow people looking at what has happened will imagine that we didn't plan for gas. Is that correct by any imagination? And what went wrong if we did plan?
Thank you very much, Pat. I think I should commend you for a good job you are doing, and give you an opportunity to talk about history and what it is to be successful. I think what caught me there is a policy history of Nigeria. To address the question, I think we maybe start from the, how do I put it? If we do not understand the product or the subject, we may not understand the history. So I will not answer your question directly. I will give where is a panorama of what has happened. Natural gas utilization in Nigeria, of course, started with oil, no doubt, because oil preceded. Nigeria was looking for oil, and we found gas in association with it. So from 1958, as a country, we have been using gas in Nigeria. But albeit within the immediate, we're calling for operational reasons predominantly at the onset, and shortly thereafter, within the immediate vicinity. And by 1964-65, Shell had started selling gas commercially in the Delta to Delta Power, glass and power plants there, to in Aba, to the small industrial estate there, bringing gas from the Imo River, which in that vicinity. And of course, by 1967, this whole process expanded to Sapele. So now, was there a plan, a master plan? If you look at the gas developmental history, you say it was evolving as it's supposed to. Gas naturally evolves. It starts from the area where it is economical for the producer to develop infrastructure and supply. But then by deliberate policy, which is then that's where your planning comes in, by deliberate policy, it is now extended to markets far from its immediate environment. And that's what has been happening in Nigeria. But we've had the challenge of formulating a policy that creates an enabling environment for investors. And so more often than not, you find government starts and government fails. I'll give you some examples. When Shell started supplying gas to Sapele in the late 60s and early 70s, remember the price of crude oil increased, more or less quadruple. So also was Nigeria's production. And with that, we had significant gas flare. Government, in its reaction by 1979, decided to pass the gas reinjection decree to stop that flaring. So we have been reactionary, and that's the point I'm trying to make. We've been responding to opportunity, but we've been reactionary. And consequently, our policy did not match the needs. Now, so that decree was supposed to be now effective by 1984. Now, the gas injection decree, and if you did not, it was supposed to be punitive. But by 1984, the IOC principal producer came and told government, hey, we can't do reinjection, the infrastructure is not there, and there's no market in Nigeria. Government had the option of punishing them or shutting them in. Either way, government was going to take the brunt of it. And that has been our struggle. I go back to the solution. What did we do? By 1984, Chief Mario, blessed memory now, Festus Mario, decided it was time to look for, if you call it a win-win situation, a market-driven initiative. That's when planning started. So by 1985, I think if I'm correct, 11th of March 1985, Chief Mario wrote Shell formally to seek collaboration, if you like, their support for us to conduct the first national gas market survey, essentially to establish the energy base of Nigeria. What was our energy usage? The point here, Pat, I was talking about, if you don't know the product, you may not understand the history. Gas has no captive market. Unlike crude oil, I can put it in a bucket and take to the market. Gas does not have it. Gas is a low density energy. And consequently, we needed to establish the market and establish base loads that will be the basis of taking gas from source or building the infrastructure from source to the market. I happen to have been a part of that study group, which Chief Mario personally identified me to participate in. And it became a joint team between Shell and NFPC. Shell dominated, but they brought the experts from the UK and around the world who have done it before. So we crisscrossed this country for 18 months, visited all the industrial estates, gathered the energy data, and also looked at, so the whole objective of that study, to cut the long story short, was that we wanted to find out what energy was being used. In other words, do the energy market segmentation, find out which energy can be displaced by gas. Because remember, gas has no captive market, it has to display it. I personally spent over a month in Shell planning, NEPA planning office to know what their current needs were and focus, so we can align ourselves with them. Because NEPA at the time and even today accounts for more than 80%, 90% actually, some studies say, of Nigeria's energy consumption, domestic energy consumption. That is the setting. So we did a survey, spent enough significant time in industry, and we went ahead and developed the framework of what we now call the Nigeria Gas Master Plan. So the idea then, establish the cost of infrastructure on the basis of which establish a price that will support or incentivize investors. Okay, AKK we are talking about today was scheduled from the study and the plan to be in place by 1992. The likes of Shell were going to form a consortium to develop that same pipeline, which we are celebrating 30 years later because we finally signed a contract to develop it. I think that's just to give you an indication. Now, Pat, did we have a plan? Yes, we started developing the plan. I started putting some sort of a structure in place to ensure that gas could be developed in a structured manner. So having developed a framework of infrastructure, having established a gas price, investors were now ready to come into the Nigerian market space. And I think that was the environment we're talking about. But I tell you something, politics infested planning. The gas pricing, which came out of that study, was presented to council under President Babangida. Yeah. It was approved in May 1989. And I always say by 3:30 p.m. on that day, we were actually celebrating. I don't have the date on my note here, but we were celebrating in the office because it's been approved. And finally, the key to unlocking all the economic benefits to Nigeria that can be derived from gas was open. Where did politics come in? 2 weeks later, in the same council, the Minister for Power, Industry, and I think it used to be called Power, Industry, and Commerce. No, Steel. Steel, they call Power, Steel, and Industry. General Nuri Imam, Air Vice Marshal Nuri Imam, came to council and said, my industry cannot pay. Now take it back. Power accounts for about 90% of our consumption. If 90% can't pay, who is going to pay? So there was a dilemma. Unfortunately for us as a nation, the president listened and the council reversed itself. And the success and the hard work of 3 years was lost. And they constituted a new committee under Professor Morvon, Science and Technology, okay, to now review. I was then, again, seconded as a technical expert. That was the beginning of our current day problem. It's not for lack of planning. It was political interference, and I would say the lack of will to enforce or implement. So,
Charles, you and I have discussed this subject through the years, one time or the other.
True.
As a story, I particularly would like you to go back to, I think it was Philip Watts, and when he came from Australia. It's a classic in this business of policy clarity. If you could tell that story again.
No, gladly. I mean, we talked about the intervention, the gas reinjection decree of 1979, decree 99 of 1979, whose objective was really to ensure that we stop flaring and gas was reinjected back into formation, or it is utilized. And this whole study I just talked about was to enable utilization because reinjection was not seen as economical. That law allowed the oil companies or the producing companies to ring-fence their investment in gas and charge it to crude oil production. Indeed, because it was associated gas, so it made sense. It was not inconsistent with what other nations had done. But Phil Watts, then country managing director and chair of Shell Group in Nigeria, now the management entity has changed. It was now Red Adams, of blessed memory also. And I happen to have been today we'll say chief of staff, his technical assistant then. That was the title I had. Early morning coffee and tea, and I'm sitting there. And Phil Watts says, Arrett, Decree 79, with all the intention, is aimed at punishing us for not investing in re-injecting gas. But could we look at it? He was telling us the story from Australia. He said Australia reversed, if you like, the same law to become a value creating or driving instrument. So instead of encouraging me to conserve gas, when your reservoirs are not conducive for it, why don't you encourage me to do exactly the same thing and develop industries? So I hope it's clear, but the idea really there for over a cup of coffee, if you want to say, look, your law should incentivize, should be driving development. And of course, Arab caught up on it, and he said, explain some more. And he explained just what I'm trying to say. And the task force was set up, and I happened to be there to see how it works. That's what led to what we will call Associated Gas Framework Agreement. The framework agreement essentially says, for the infrastructure you needed to re-inject gas, make those same investments, but turn it into a commercial entity. Take, for example, what are those projects we can talk about quickly? ExxonMobil also, NGL project in Bonny, Chevron's in Forcados, Agip's or ENI's power plant in Okpai. A host of industry arose from that law. I mean, if you like, not a law. The law existed, it's still in the books. Don't change the law, but extend it to commercial ventures instead of just conservation. And I think that's what turned the gas industry around. And if you look at our history, during that period, we had landmark projects, developmental projects in terms of gas utilization. That's what even benefited Nigeria LNG. Because now the producers could also ring-fence the gathering of gas, okay, that they're going to supply to NLNG. So it automatically made our resources more competitive in the market. And well, that's the gist of it. You asked me this question, I can take it up again. But Pat, again, it boils down to policies, politics, and practice. The practice all over the world is that you plan based on data, you create a win-win situation, and investors come in to invest. Unfortunately, we have had political interference. And so the nice policy that was approved was reversed. And we then created a forgery that now segmented Nigerian pricing structure into what you may call commercial, industry, and industry being government industry at that time. And then you have power. So power had the lowest price. And if power is the lowest and they consume the most, it meant the development of gas infrastructure in Nigeria will remain on a case-by-case basis. In other words, you will now single them out, identify those that are viable, and you develop them. And those that are not viable, no matter what the market opportunity were, remain on the wish list. And that's where we have been in the country. And with the subsidy stories and all, we remain there. I hope I won't take too much time to explain.
Okay. Thanks so very much. Now we are going to go to you talked about how that policy was a boost for the NLNG, and perhaps this is the time to turn to Dr. Ihe to basically ask the question, because in the early days, all that we knew NLNG for was the politics of the process. It was classic recursive thing, 2 steps forward, 4 steps backwards. There were always stories in the newspapers, this board fire, this board created. Perhaps Dr. Hetu can, from his experience, tell us why NLNG got off to that kind of start, which gave Indonesia, obviously, the huge advantage. Before we finally got going, Indonesia was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 trains going forward, and we were just barely coming on. A bit about the history of policy interference and the NLNG getting off to a slow start, even though it will become the model that we are all now so proud of today. Dr. Hetu, please unmute. And if we could see more of your face than your ceiling, it would be nice. Fantastic. A little more to go. No, we are reversing the trend. Aha. So, and then on mute. Yeah. You're muted. Okay. Okay, please go ahead. Your audio, please connect your audio. Okay, your audio is connecting. Yeah. Okay, now your audio is connected. I'll mute and then let's
mute. Yeah.
Yeah, now we hear you.
You can hear me now.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Right? Since you started with LNG, let me go to that history. And I note that this is your history series, in fact. So the history is very important here. As has been mentioned before, we started.
Okay. You know, yeah. Even as we're hearing you, it would have been good to still adjust the headroom a little more. Aha, yeah.
Is it better?
Yes, better.
All right. So when we made the first shipment of crude oil in 1958, we were already grappling with what to do with the gas. That's as far back as 1958. Now, in the early 60s, Shell started talking about LNG because the UK and Europe presented some kind of market there. But that was before the Dutch discovered.
Maybe you can also mute, put off one of the devices because there's a feedback.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
So the LNG
still a little bit there. Maybe I know that feeling, you know, you want both on because sometimes one can fail, but it then leads to feedback.
I have some things I need to present from there.
Okay.
Anyway, yeah.
Just put up the audio of one audio.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do now.
Yeah. The thing about this technology is that it is a little unfriendly to people who were born after or before 1960.
I know. I'm not about to tell you my age now.
No, at least it was before 1960. We use that as a benchmark.
Yeah, let me just switch this thing up.
You know, the way that some people I know have done it is they've made sure one of the grandchildren was around.
Yeah.
So that...
Well, don't worry. One of them has died. So I mean the device.
The device, yes.
So it should be okay now.
Oh, lovely.
Now, what I'm trying to say is that the idea of establishing an LNG plant started in about 1965, and Shell had actually made quite some progress in that venture. But then the Civil War came, and then there were also issues of instability, and there were new markets, new discoveries in the North Sea. So this venture was abandoned. 1971, after the war, Shell again came up with ideas on LNG. As they were discussing, the other IOCs, namely Gulf Oil, as it used to be, also had ideas on what to do about LNG. They were looking at the Bonny area, One project was to be on Bonny Island. The other one was to be on the other side of the estuary, Peter side. In the end, to cut a long story short, all these companies got together to form the Bonny LNG Limited. It was incorporated in 1976. It goes that far back. And there were 9 shareholders, including Phillips. Phillips was made the operator, and Phillips was supposed to organize the process and the manpower and all of that. The project was to start with 6 trains of LNG. That will compare that with how we started in 1989 with 2 trains. They planned for 6 trains and 18 ships. You can imagine how the budget would have escalated. Now, by 1980, 79, 80, the civilian government had come in. Oil prices were depressed, and there was no way Shagari's government could support that project. That was how, by 1981, Phillips pulled out because there were delays and debates in council whether to go on or go or abandon. Eventually, that company collapsed. The company was no longer able to proceed because some shareholders pulled out. That was the end of the Bonny LNG project. Very fine plan, program, everything, but then just couldn't go. Now, with the civilian government also felt, yes, there is something to do here. So they now started talking about how to get this project going again. It didn't take off before the civilian government was overthrown in 1983. Now, come 1984, the Buhari government now empaneled the LNG Working Committee to continue where the Bonny LNG stopped. And that was how we got to the point of incorporating the NLNG, Nigeria LNG, in 1989. So I mentioned a date of 1989 for plans and so on. But by this time, the gas thing had really gone ahead. Even by the time the Bonny LNG was incorporated in 1976, there were already organized structures for gas supply by the shareholders. So I would say that the launch of the NLNG or incorporation of the NLNG in 1989 actually put us, we had a pedal on the gas. But you would note that we had crisis. Arrett's name has been mentioned, and he lost his job because of the politics of the time. I became managing director in 1990, again, because of the politics of the time. My predecessor was in office for, I think, 2 months. So we had these challenges. And then, of course, we also had our own board crisis in 1992. Again, government ministerial interference. But in any case, fortunately, it didn't lead to the dissolution of the company. But after that, there were clearly some adjustments to be made. I don't want to get into the politics of the award of the contract, which was the real reason for the crisis. But anyway, fortunately, the project was relaunched. But I have to say here that in relaunching the project, the shareholders, of course, made it clear that they were displeased by the way government kept interfering with the structures of the companies. Like Ejikonya left 1989, and then I was living in 1992. So the relaunch, there were a number of adjustments made. First of all, Shell, a major promoter and a major the technical advisor, insisted that one of the ways they can come back in is if they have the managing director position. That was how NNPC lost that position to Shell. So till today, Babs is here. That's why Babs got in as MD at that point. But we have Tony Atta now MD from Shell. Another thing that happened there was that the government was very ambitious in the original shareholding of the company. The government gave itself 60%. And if you held 60% in a company, that company will be a subsidiary of your company. It will not be a private company per se. So what happened was that now with the relaunch, the shareholding of NNPC or the government came down to 49, which immediately removed the powers from government. So the board of NLNG today is independent. The minister cannot wake up and say, I have sacked the board or I have sacked the MD or anything. So that was the solid foundation that led to the success of NLNG. And I believe Babs will talk more about NLNG later. But those are the points that one needed to make. Then on planning generally, I have a feeling that a lot of planning had taken place in the early 70s because by 1976, we already had a report on the supply of gas from Escravos in the Delta, West Delta, to Lagos. There was a debate as to what should happen. Should there be a transmission line from the Delta, from West Delta, Ughelli area, which Charles has also mentioned? Should there be a transmission line? Sorry?
That Charles has spoken to.
Yeah, spoken to. Should there be a transmission line taking power from the Delta all the way to Lagos? Or is it better to build a gas pipeline so you can have a power plant in Lagos? Well, it so happened that when I got involved in this in 1980, I was given a report of a study by a company called Earl & Wright. That report was submitted to NNPC, and the bottom line or the rumor there was that this is too expensive, we cannot do it. When I got involved in 1980, the then acting managing director of NNPC, Chief Lolo Mari, gave me the report because the then advisor on petroleum, Yaya Diko, who was a NEPA man, who came from NEPA, who was former MD of NEPA, he was concerned that that report was going nowhere and asked whether it is really true that the kind of costs we are seeing were realistic. Well, I took this report and I saw that a lot of facilities were incorporated in it. and that was why it was so expensive. And I recommended that those facilities, compressor stations on the route be completely removed. When my report finally came out, it was clear that that pipeline would be viable or was affordable. That was how we finally committed, or NMPC finally committed to the Egbin pipeline. And of course, once you have a pipeline on that route, it brings a lot of development en route. That's why we had all the other power stations on that route. And of course, from getting gas into Lagos, you now had gas going into Ogun State and the industrial areas of Lagos. So that gives a little bit of an idea of how this manifested the gas industry developed. Well, since then, we have talked about 2 other LNG plants which have not taken off.
Let me come back to you before you go to that. I'll come back to you. By the way, it's important to adjust the cameras all properly because they also have impact on sound and all of that. But let me, at this point, go to Chief Oyibo. From perspective of NNPC as a holding company and what seems to be like the governance of permanent crisis. I'm borrowing here as a nice book on the politics of permanent crisis, in Africa or whatever. But there seems to be permanent crisis in these companies, and the NNPC obviously had a duty to moderate these things, given the impact on the developments in the industry. I wonder what the thinking in NNPC was about why there were all these crises, and what a line of thinking there was about how to mute them, seeing the negative impact on the growth of the sector.
But I think you brought the experts. You said talked about planning. Our problem in Nigeria and NNPC was not planning or policy. It was execution and government interference at different levels. Government interfered with our plans, government interfered with our management, government interfered with funding. For example, to get the LNG going, collaboration with the partners decided that we were going to get approval of government to sell some crude and put an escrow account. Now, when Abacha's government came, they wanted that money from escrow account. But also an NPC had to obviously hide this money. One of the agreements with the shareholders was that if any member withdrew from that account, the project was dead on arrival. That was the only way we were able to protect that money. So there have been a lot of issues. He said dead bodies. There were a lot of dead bodies.
Buried around the place.
Yes, all over the place. We've had this problem of 30-year cycle. I think Charles mentioned, and I think Sonia had also mentioned. We had good plans, good policies, but when it came to execution, there will be delays. We will only get what the right word was, try to get into the door after it has been shut. Malaysia and Indonesia took advantage of this gas, just like it has been said. We were to go into North Sea, into Western Europe, until the Civil War, and then they discovered more hydrocarbons and gas. Eventually, we started our gas project. Then we had the Americans. We did not have any issue of planning, but execution. And I want to say a few things. One of the things also for the Bonny LNG and the what Sonny talked about was technology change, Philips technology. Eventually, we had to change the technology because Shell had operated a different technology in Malaysia, and they want that technology, which made sense because since they were now in the driving seat. Your question to us today is how have we managed our gas endowment? And some mention has been made of the LNG. LNG is the biggest user of our gas, but from the beginning, the Aba industries, the Port Harcourt industries in the Transamadi area, the Ugeli, Sapele, all these were executed and were able to utilize some of the gas. The gas for NAFCON, for the LMA petrochemicals, where gas was used at feedstock, encouragement of gas as for cooking, for domestic. We had to have a balance of gas for export and gas for domestic use.
Yeah.
In every country, even now, I keep on saying that all these people were importing gas from us. They are not drinking the gas. They use it for power generation and they use it as feedstock in their industries. And if we have to continue in the developing our gas, we have to use it. We have to find ways of using it more in this country. The LNG, after train 1 to 6, we had so much delay again. I think I believe Babs will probably talk about that. We have this penchant for delay until it becomes too late. Then we run into it. Now, hydrocarbons are becoming getting out of fashion. We want to, I believe government will now get up and say, we change our policies to, we're going to help you execute policies. They just started marginal, giving us, they're trying to give us some new marginal fields. But the policies of these new marginal fields are much more difficult than the original ones in 2003. Even the payments, the initial payments are so high. When banks are not willing to fund, and then when foreign partners are saying, hey, we cannot put so much money in your hydrocarbon business. So government has not been consistent. And so what I will suggest is that government should leave the NNPC alone to plan and bring for them to approve. There should always be interministerial, whether Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Industry or Ministry of Finance, all the relevant people should get in at the right time. Now it's going to take us about 30 years before we approve our petroleum industry bill. The most important bill, 1999 to now, I think 20 something years, but they're waiting for the 30-year cycle before they approve it. So, but what you are doing, I hope that when you put this together, it will make sense to the people in government. When you say government, it's not just the executive. The legislature doesn't know anything about it. And they have consultants, then they sack the consultants, sometimes they won't pay them. So we don't know where to go. We spent all our lives in this industry, and you find that we take one foot forward, we take another foot backwards. So we're virtually in the same place. Although it is our country and our industry, so we cannot give up.
But I tend to suggest something in some of these situations. When we had a series on health, almost all the former ministers of health complained so much about these things, about how the ideas they tried to generate were treated the day after. And I suggested to them, I said, look, if all of you former ministers of health had a loose consultation group, and you know what policies you all try to generate, what's good for the country, you're not in office, and a new health minister is appointed, and he's going to begin afresh to try new things, if all of you can go to him quietly and educate him as to where we've gotten to, the cost of yesterday, perhaps he may understand that to fudge and fuss around will only bring greater, if you will, condemnation from history. He may learn something and behave differently. And so perhaps I should challenge all of you who have played very important roles in the oil industry. As I keep saying, in a book I wrote back in the middle 90s, I had gone to interview Dr. John just shortly after he left the position of Group Managing Director of NMPC. And I had said to him, look, wouldn't we be better off if we privatized NMPC? And very coyly he said, my goodness, I thought it was privatized a long time ago. And I was wondering what he was saying. And he said, well, the problem is that those who own it did not pay for it. Now, the question is, if all of you got together and said, look, these are the reasons that things have not gone as they should go, without making it a public fight, as politicians tend to defend their ego with more wrong policies, and quietly went to our stakeholders, whoever is the decision maker at that time, and say, look, this is the cost of these kinds of errors to our country. Perhaps we should do X, Y, and Z. Would that be something out of place?
Is that a question for me to
To
answer?
you.
Okay. Yes. The ministers of health and other ministries may be encouraged to form a group. If all the former group managing directors start saying they want to influence, merely government will be very, in fact, they will tell the GMD not to cooperate. Privately, we'll try to, because most of them, the recent ones, are people who work for us, and they're very, they're good, they're gentlemen, and they're very knowledgeable. But when it comes to policies, everything goes to the presidency. So that one has to tread very carefully when you want to advise your successors, because they themselves are a bit they're wary of the consequences. That's why I asked whether you really want me to answer that question. There are groups. There are things that
ring fence decision making in an NMPC. Advise government so that
when they can
prevent these problems from coming. Because everybody's eye goes to NMPC, that's where they find resources.
Exactly.
Yeah. What would we be doing if we wanted to ring fence decision making in NMPC? Save it from government interference. What would be the best way to structure governance in NMPC?
You have to adopt the LNG, Nigerian LNG structure.
Model.
Model. Then it will not be easy for somebody.
That was what I had in mind precisely when I asked that question of Dr. John. That was what I had in mind when I asked that question.
Because
model.
Unless you do that, you don't want somebody. How many years did it take from Dr. John to Edmond Dakoru to Chamberlain Oyibo? It's always on the 9 o'clock news or so, you are fired. That's not the way companies are run. So,
corporate governance.
But with the LNG structure, it cannot fire the managing director. It's the board that has the right. Even though the shareholders have nominated the managing director, the board has to appoint him formally, and there is the board that has the right. And the board that setting the objectives, what is to achieve. And if he's doing that, and he doesn't get himself, honestly, mess himself up, the board cannot sack him until his time is up. And that's why they made progress since, even though it's government that delayed Train 7. OK LNG is government. Brass LNG is government. All the studies, preliminary work in Brass LNG that done the sand filling and all those things, and government did not move forward with it. So the government has to take these companies and set up separate companies and bring in private people who have majority shares so that we can get our projects going. We don't have much time anymore because of what's happening in the developed world with
hydrocarbons.
Hydrocarbon.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Let me turn to Babs at this point. Babs Omoto was managing director of NLNG until a few short years ago. During the period he was there, we saw significant progress with the model that was adopted. Babs, what do you think is the biggest governance challenge in the kind of structure that NLNG ran during your watch? What advantages can we learn from it, and what shortcomings are there anyway? How did government interference get managed? And I still recall the story from your recent book on the visit to NLNG by the finance minister and the intrigue and all of that followed it.
Thank you very much, Prof. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you, yes.
All right. Thanks. I think I would first indeed go back to the title of the series in terms of how did we manage gas and still manage it, and then build gradually into your question. I think, of course, Chief Oyibo and Engineer Sezo and Dr. Hetu have shared a lot of the history and some of the perspective. But my view as well is, of course, that we have not managed things well as a country. I think you can nearly describe our story as the good, the bad, and the ugly. I think the good, of course, is that we are fortunate that God blessed us with huge gas reserves. I think we're in the top 10 of the world's biggest gas reserves in the world. So one can say that's actually good. The bad, of course, is that indeed we did discover gas accidentally, as has been described, but we have not gone after it in a very, very coordinated manner. Today, we have indeed about 200 TCF of gas, but we all know that we have more than 600 TCF unproven yet, but still even many, many more, I think, reserves that we can go after. We have not gone after them in any coordinated manner. And I think the ugly, of course, is what has been said. Our planning has, I think, been, quite fluid. It has changed as interference by government has, I think, affected it. And I think a very hawkish approach has also led to investors not coming into this sector as much as need to come in. I think Engineer Sizo has described some of that hawkish tendencies. We don't want to pay the right prices. We're very punitive in our approach as a country, rather than being incentivized as we need to for investors. So I think, indeed, when you look at today, we produce about 8 BCF per day of gas. 40% of that goes to NLNG, 30% is still reinjected, and only about 20% goes into power and industries. And sadly, we still flare more than 10% of our gas. I think over 800 million scopes a day is still being flared today across facilities. And I think when you then look at it from that perspective, and you compare us to similar countries in the world, we definitely are punching way below our weight. I think, we've talked about both the export and the domestic use of gas. In both sides, we are punching below our weight. I think on the export, if you look at it, countries like Qatar doing 77 million tons a day, Australia working towards 80 million tons a day, Nigeria is still at 23 million tons. We clearly should be doing 3 times more than we're doing. When you look at our petrochemicals, I think it's a very pathetic story. Apart from LMA that is, of course, doing well, we have a few ethanol plants and very limited when you think about all the abilities to use gas for aluminum, to use it for plastics, to use it for a lot that petrochemicals can bring. In Qatar, the Ras Laffan Industrial Park is quite a sight to behold, 4,300 hectares. I think a few years ago, we were thinking of something similar in Ogidigben in Delta State. But again, as usual, that plan has gone to the dreams. Again, if you look at power, we're only doing about 1.5 BCF of gas to power a day. We should be doing 6 times more of that to power. And sadly, we can all see the impact of that on electrification in the country. So clearly we are punching, I think, way below our weight as a country. We are not doing well in either the export or the domestic abilities. And I think many of the issues have been talked about. Even when you think of the plan, I think Engineer Sizwa described some of them. But if I even look at recent times, we've had everything from a gas master plan in 2008, which had the domestic gas obligations, had the likes of Ogidigben. A few years later, that plan was thrown into the bin. We've had gas policies in 2017. We've recently had the gas flare commercialization project that is today sitting on the shelves. We're currently talking of a decade of gas, which is good to hear, but it's more about words than actions in itself. So quite a very challenging business environment. We really haven't done well to what we need to do, and there are many very reasons for that. I think Chief Onyibo has already mentioned that the window is closing. I said in 2014, while I was MD of Nigeria LNG, that our window of opportunity is closing, and I think it's even closed a lot more than then. I think the IEA brought out a recent report where they showed that there's actually no need to invest anymore in hydrocarbons. the world can get to 1.5-degree world without any further investments in hydrocarbons. And you can see many of the IOCs are already starting to reduce their investment in hydrocarbons. I think Total is looking at less than 20% of hydrocarbons in its portfolio by 2050. Shell is reducing by 2% every year. They already have announced they want to leave Nigeria onshore. And most of the international majors are reducing their investments in hydrocarbon and increasing their investments in alternative significantly. So we really have a limited window of opportunity as a country to utilize our gas well. Of course, we can always use it for our domestic, where we still have a lot of opportunities. But I think over time, we will still see the challenge. So great that we have a decade of gas again. How long that will last, I won't be surprised if with the new government come in 2023, probably we start talking something different again as a country. So we really have huge challenges. Coming to your specific question, Prof,
yeah.
And I think Dr. Hetu and Chief Oyinbo have mentioned a few of some of the reasons why an LNG model has been successful, but it's not a perfect model in itself, which I think goes to your question of what are some of the challenges. I will describe briefly some of why it's been successful, and I will also describe some of the ongoing challenges, and also, why we need to continue to keep an eye on it. Otherwise, it can easily become another struggling venture in itself. I think indeed the fact that the majority shareholder has been in private hands. Initially, it was supposed to just be 49% with the IOCs, 2% with the IFC, and 49% with NNPC after the 60% NNPC was downgraded. But the IFC, of course, pulled out after Ken Saro-Wiwa. And today, the IOCs have 51% and the NNPC has 49%. I think that delicate balance has been a very, very important part of why it's been successful. It allows the company run on international best practice governance processes, whilst at the same time ensuring that the local value chain is not lost in that whole process. So the balance of international best practices with local best practices or local requirements, I think have been a very good balance, but making sure it's international allows it to be run as a private venture and not run as a pseudo government venture, which we see happens in some of the refineries and some of the ventures that the government has majority shareholders that haven't run very, very well. And I think Dr. Hetu mentioned that as well, the fact that the CEOs have to now come from private IOC Shell, was a decision, painful as it was, because it's not because the staff of NNPC are not as good as the IOCs. I think they're as good. We all went to the same universities and we're all the same. But I think the fact that the IOCs come from Shell indeed ensures two things. One, that we don't wake up one day on the radio and hear that the CEO has been fired, which I think Dr. Hetu and Dr. Onye and the previous NNPC MDs had to face that a situation which is not good for any company to survive. And I remember during my tenure as well, because of my refusal at a point to pay $2 billion as it was at that time to the government 6 months before it was due. It was for the company income tax was demanded of me in January, which was due in June, and I refused to pay that. There was effort made to remove me as CEO. Actually, a letter was written to remove me as CEO, but as Chief Oyinbo rightly said, that letter would have only gone to the shareholders and the directors, who on that occasion refused to remove me because they said I had not done anything wrong. So, that shows you what the delicacy that still exists, because I think you still have officials in government still trying to interfere, but the solid shareholder independent joint venture provides that cover that I think is still good. The second reason I think has been successful, independent joint venture has a board of its own. So decision making is very, very quick, very, very fast. and it takes weeks to get an approval from the board to carry out turnaround maintenance, to build infrastructure, be it pipelines, or even when we had to build airstrips, our maintenance turnaround happens in weeks. I think in the refineries, they will wait for 2 years to get an approval because the approval will not only go to the NNPC board, in some cases it may need to go to the Federal Executive Council, which will take 2 years at the very least. And if you have that situation, no wonder the turnaround maintenance doesn't happen well. And when it does happen, the refinery has gone into a very bad state. So independent board allows faster decision making, and that impact is seen in the performance. I think also that independence means we can finance the company very, very easily. The company is financed from its own funds, or we can raise international financing very quickly. During my time, I raised $1.6 billion to build 6 new ships. I went internationally, raised it. The company had better credit rating than Nigeria had, which meant that we could get financing cheaper than Nigeria would even get. Again, that's what you get from that 51% international partnership that you have, and independent joint venture that you have. So financing, you don't have to wait for federation appropriation. You don't have to wait for all that challenge that goes through, that refineries and the rest have to go through. And I think we cannot underplay the NLNG Act and the impact it had. It's not a popular, and I know legislators don't like that. Many people in Nigeria don't like the act, but it provided stability for the company. It's one of the things that I think, has been mentioned, the interference that happens to organization. By having an NLNG Act, it defined very clearly the incentives that were given to the company. And I think Engineer Sizwa mentioned that rightly. You need to give incentives for companies to be ready to invest their money in your country. Otherwise, they can go elsewhere. They don't have to come to Nigeria. And the NLNG Act provided some incentives for the company, but also provided stability. There were 10 years of tax-free. There were evergreen incentives that meant that interferences were not allowed in the company. And I think those stability, those incentives are important when you want to attract investment into a country. We must remember that every country in the world today is looking for investment. And for any investor to come to Nigeria, if it's not local, they really need to find that we are a stable economy, we are a stable environment from security perspective. We have incentives such as tax holidays and all of that. And I think that NLNG Act was also part of its success. So those, I think, were some of the reasons why NLNG has been successful today. And when we talk about gas flaring, more than 65% of the reduction in gas flaring, you can attribute it to NLNG. But it is not a it is not a perfect system, Prof, I will say. It still must continue to be managed very, very well. One of the reasons, of course, for the success has always been the shareholder committees that support the company. These shareholder committees are representative of the shareholders. Part of it is, of course, the technical expertise that still has to be brought to the company. I think Engineer Sizwa mentioned earlier, Shell has operated NLNG plants in Malaysia, in Brunei. These are 90-year-old, 100-year-old plants. There are different things you do at different stages of a plant. And if you don't have those expertise to help the company, you might easily not prepare yourself before you face some challenges. And Brunei did face some of those challenges and cost them more than 2 years. Having those committees are very important, and the quality of people you have in those committees are very important. I will say that the quality of people that we put into the shareholder committees, the quality of people that we have in the board, I think are key if the company will continue to remain successful as we go along. And I think the only other thing I'll mention is the fact that the government interference or the government impact on the company is not yet totally immune. I think Chief Onyebo rightly mentioned, Train 7 was delayed for many, many years, for decades, because of the interference or the lack of support, if I will call it, from the government. Train 7 should have happened a long time ago. The plans was for 12 trains. We should by now have been talking Train 8, Train 9, probably Train 10. But the lack of government support, the distraction into other projects, I think, continues to also be a risk
Put on
for the
generator
government as well.
Thanks, Babs. Two quick questions together here before we're going to go to Q&A in so minutes. But the human capital aspect, NLNG has been raised for, a Nigerianization of the team, and why it is possible to Nigerianize a technical venture like that, and we have this elsewhere in the country, what was done. And then the second thing, I have for quite some time argued, suggested, as great as things are going, we don't really know the value of energy. If we listed on the London stock, it will give us the value and probability in Nigeria. And
Prof, we are losing you. We're not hearing your question clearly.
The first part of the question was about organization, the fact that at that level you have the company is significantly possible to achieve that.
Oh wow! Probably I've lost Pat.
Pat, I think we lost you.
I think we lost Pat. Well, he's still there. Still there.
Okay, I think I was unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Now,
I hear you, Pat.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, now.
You're used to me. You can hear me now.
We're
The first part of the
you.
question was about human capital and how it is possible to have Nigerianized significantly. Right. The second one was about listing the NLNG on the London Stock Exchange, New York Stock Exchange, wherever. And that will give us a fair sense for the real value of the company. And that can be valuable for financing, public financing for 49% of the company that's listed on the London Stock Exchange. What are your thoughts on those?
So if I make a quick start at it Prof, I will say to you that in terms of the value of NLNG, if you listed it, of course, it will only be known when you list. But I think desktop exercises will say that if you've earned 140 billion in about 22 years, which is, I think, roughly about 7 billion a year, you may be looking at a valuation closer to 50 to 70 billion dollars. So, kind of rough calculations, but until you list it, you will never know. And I will say, Prof, that was, of course, the thought at the beginning when IFC was holding at least 2% of the shares, was that at some point IFC would have relinquished those 2%, and Nigerians would have been able to buy into the company. And I think it's still worth doing that in NLNG and considering that listing. On the Nigerianization plan, of course, I would say that there were two things that made it successful. One, there was a plan, and that plan was executed, I think, as perfect as it should be. The plan identified at what stage each of the elements will be Nigerianized, starting from the technical to the managerial, and it set, the plan of, how people will be trained and how the technical experiences will be gained by young Nigerians being recruited and sent to overseas plants to train them. So, the beauty of NLNG is you can set a clear plan and execute it exactly as you have planned. And I think that was what made that Nigerianization work exactly as it was planned, which I will say is the benefit of having a 49% Nigerian ownership, because if you just had only the IOCs, that plan may not have been as robust as that, and may not have been executed as well as that.
Okay, lovely. We'll take
before you started with me, and
I'm coming back to you, but maybe you can say something now, because the question I was going to ask next to you, maybe you can take that before we take questions and add it to what you may have in mind to say now. Is should we have a process? We hear about we had this whole project, and then all these were done, and then it was abandoned, and should there be a review process where once a plan gets underway, put in place, and government cannot walk away from it without a kind of public review process? Because these things kind of drop out of sight without people, LNG, brass LNG, they just have become stories. Should there not be a process for a plan that has been nationally approved, not following the track, if it's going to be abandoned for whatever reason? Because it just happened, and we wake up one day and, oh my goodness, we're talking about this program 10 years ago, but it seems to have disappeared.
Well, but I think you absolutely, I agree with you. There should be a review. But let's put it this way. What you are talking about really, Pat, is about accountability.
Yeah.
Any project that is approved, there are clear deliverables, and there is a monitoring process, there should be consequences of failure. Unfortunately, in Nigeria, there are no consequences for failure. So you fail on one project, if it's government or public-owned project, you go to another, and there's no consequence about it. I mean, I'm on the other side. I mean, I'm in the private sector, essentially promoting projects. When you have shareholders and the bank, and you have guaranteed it, as a promoter, always your personal guarantee is sought. Whatever asset you have in your life are assigned to it. I tell you, I remember gas when I was doing it. I told people when I joined, I said, well, even if they sold my whole village, the guarantee I've signed, we may not be able to pay. But with that kind of body, you then go ahead with it. Unfortunately, in Nigeria, we don't have it. So I agree with you, we should have accountability. And it's not just on projects, but it should be in the nation. If you look at our projects, once they are sanctioned or approved by government, they become law. But somehow, we have laws. Even with that, we think that gives you security and if you like, consistency. And therefore, there's the chance of failure is minimized. Unfortunately, we don't have it. We don't have process of liquidation where people have to give account. I think Dr. Hetu talked about Bonny LNG and the processes of liquidation and asset or whatever technology was developed was transferred. Now, that's my first take on that. Now, but a couple of things I wanted to comment on before your question. I mean, in our general summation, the point that government affairs is bad for business has been consistent. I couldn't agree more. But I think as professionals, we also have to accept that there are certain faults. Bob talked about coordination in our planning and policy. I don't want to disagree with my boss, Chief Oyimbo. But sir, we've had plans in our industry. But very often, every administration starts its own planning. So what we had were heaps of plans. And I think Babs made that said it eloquently. And so there's discontinuity with plans. I thought about what Chief Mario started, for instance, with the gas, now called Gas Master Plan. That study led to the backbone of our gas infrastructure. Subsequently, to feed that, we're there talking about ACFA. But thereafter, there was complete discontinuation. Until many years later, then somebody woke up and said, oh, Gas Master Plan. And they were the originator, but they have never studied, nor did they know how the data were gathered and the maps by the economists, how it was developed. Yeah, So we've had these fractures in our planning. So I dare say they are not coordinated. We've not had continuity in our plan, and we've not leveraged on the successes of the previous administration, even in NNPC. Sir. The other point, yes, is part of corporate governance. Dr. Hetu said it eloquently. You know, yeah, he was leaving, and of course there was that resolution as part of corporate governance to ensure the managing director comes from the private sector. But sir, I was a member of the technical advisory committee of the board, which Babs referred to. And I think we were the continuity, if you like, in this whole session at this time. That was a concession because as part of financing for the project, they needed NNPC to consider that position. And the logic, the argument they made that I was, in a country that has not been able to run a cooking pot, that was the word, a refinery, how can we entrust them to run a cryogenic plant? So it sounds painful, but those were also part of our history. And so when you start talking about financing, we wanted stability in the corporate governance, and they wanted to be sure that those who are going to start it have run plants before, not just qualification. That is, NSP had to consider that position. The final point for me was the 1992 change, and for me, it was always very personal. And I will explain on this platform, I guess, maybe for the first time, which led to my resignation from NNPC. A lot of people don't know why, but I tell you, when the Hague, Shell and all the other Shell proposal for technology selection happened to align with the Philip Bechtel technology. It was cheaper by more than $25 million, but there was a big debate. Our national policy objective, all the laws we have set, was how to utilize associated gas. However, the Philip Bechtel technology could not use more than 10% of associated gas. In other words, it could not take excess rich gas. But the alternative, remember, there were only two bidders, was Air Products. And Air Product had many more plants, and their technology was more flexible. I took a minority position. And that minority position, I sent from the Hague to Dr. Swilly, who was then the chairman of the board, who also happened to be my direct boss, but I was his technical assistant again. Okay, I remember that I was almost like a professional technical assistant. I was advising everybody, whatever it was. That became my title, from one office to the other. But the point here is that IMO escalated that to the president, who endorsed it and instructed the directors of NNPC, or government-nominated directors, not to approve. 5 of them voted with Shell, and consequently, they were removed. And I think for me, that was the first time in my experience in corporate world or in a government circle that, no, sir, you have your point to respond, sir. I was there. And Chief Olakuri was the only person that did not vote. She was the only one that was retained on the board. All the others were retired. Dr. Swilly is still there. I think it was the last program. So this can be verified. But at the end of it all, the environment for me was personally risky. And that's why I resigned from the industry, not from NNPC, from the industry, and I went to run an NGO to promote the Lagos Business School. So, for me, it's been a case of saying it is possible to do something well and to build excellence. But we learned from our mistakes. So there were challenges. Those were the two technologies. Okay, I stopped there. So, Pat, that was what I wanted to just comment on. I'm glad they started controversy. I can see Dr. Ihetu's hand, and I can see.
Okay, let's quickly take one or two questions. Just a few things about the questions. Please, very, very brief and to the point. 30 seconds, max 1 minute. Let's start with Mr. Chikenwanze.
Thank you very much, Pat. I just want to make some comment. It's not necessarily a question. Several years back, during the time of Ndio Kiriko Nyuke, I know the operators in the capital market approached the NNPC. The way the oil companies operate now with NNPC, all this cash call participation is 60%. You bring 60% of the budget. They bring 40% of the budget. In most cases, the budget are, in the case of Shell, I worked in Shell. The budget in Shell is prepared in either in SIPC in London or SIPM at the Hague, and they bring the budget here and it's approved. Nigeria contributes 60%. Shell also contributes 40%. They share the oil, in that ratio, and that's the end of it. Even the selling of the oil. Even sometimes Shell was prepared sending the invoice. In 1974, I was head of oil and gas accounts in Shell. That this is not viable until really we privatize. And a suggestion was made by the operators in the capital market. There's no need. Shell is quoted on the London Stock Exchange, on the Netherlands Stock Exchange. Why don't you come to the capital market and raise the money you need? Unfortunately, most of the opposition that the operators of the capital market got was from the NNPC itself, management of NNPC. They did not want that, that privatization going to the capital market. Until we do that, and this was long before Aramco went to the market. Aramco, before Apple now became, hit the $3 trillion market cap. Aramco was the highest
company.
Aramco. That's Aramco. Before Apple hit the $1 trillion capital market cap.
Valuation.
But yes, Aramco was the highest capitalized company in the New York Stock Exchange before Apple. Until we do that, the problem is not in all these subsidiaries. The NNPC itself has to be, because all the representative of government in the first and then any of these subsidiaries are from NNPC. Until we really restructure NNPC itself, go to the capital market. You heard what the MD from Mr. Omotowa mentioned. What is happening they could go to the market. We need to go to the market and go to the capital market and raise money and get out of all this government. That's the only way.
That all goes back to the famous ownership policy that Dr. John pointed to.
Yeah. So that's my comment, really. Until we do that, if this PIB has been hanging there for how many years now, even the PIB won't do anything. Yes. Mm.
Okay, let's take Julie Omeke. Yes, Julie, please unmute yourself and speak. Okay, we're not getting Julie. Can we move to Chibueze Izubu? Sorry if I didn't get that right.
Yeah, Izubu, Chibueze Izubu.
Izubu, oh, Izubu, okay.
Thank you, Prof, and thank all the gentlemen that has given a lot of insight here. First of all, I want to ask regarding the Trans-Sahara pipeline, what contribution probably the insecurity in North, the Boko Haram activity has impacted the Trans-Sahara pipeline. And again, I also want to make one comment. I want to a little bit differ from the standpoint that everything lies on NNPC or some of the government programs. I think most of the problem with the gas, commercializing gas in Nigeria has to do with the market. So our market is still well underdeveloped here. Most of the industries that were supposed to be at the Trans-Amade industrial zone, the Aba, and the UAE supply that was mentioned earlier, probably because of one thing or another was not properly developed to power gas in that zone. And because of that, the government focused more on transferring gas to the southwest, which was more costly to do than those who are nearby. And so I want to know what is the stage of the
pipeline.
Yeah, pipeline. And
okay,
again,
we'll get to that in a minute. We'll put the questions together. Perhaps Chifoyibo could also speak to that when we get to that. We'll take Dr. Chizie, Boniface Chizie.
Okay, but thank you. You're doing a good job. I've listened, and it's quite intriguing, quite interesting. I came here because Independence Anniversary is coming up June 12th. And I've been asked to do papers on the economy and so on and so forth by many papers. They're going to come out and then talk about Nigerian economy at independence. And so I said I'll come here because I've heard so much about the fact that Nigeria is the gas territory with oil associated. So I've had that severally. And I said to myself, I'll come here and see if there are any low-hanging fruits, which we can tap, because we have a crisis in our hands. We have a crisis of fiscal sustainability, so we don't have revenue inflows and so on. And we're going on a borrowing binge and so on and so forth. So we borrow and then we mortgage the future and so on and so forth. So there are lots of challenges. So I'll come here, but I listen to discussions. And at some point in time, I was hopeful. But towards the end, we talked about the fact that even the gas itself, is getting out of relevance. As we talk of alternative sources of energy and companies that are getting out of investments in this area and so on. So I said to myself, given the crisis we have now on hand, is there anything we can do in this sector? Can we maybe be a bit ingenious? Of course, Chicken One has spoken, go to capital market and do some swaps or derivatives and so on. They sell the 10 up front. We need money. We can't keep on borrowing the way we're doing now. That's something trillion naira of debt.
That's essentially the same point I was making about listing. If you listed NLNG on the London Stock Exchange, yes, and the federal government sold half of 1%, yes, it can raise several $100 million, perhaps, depending on the value that it attracts, and get that into the budget process and not have to borrow. Yes. That's part of the challenge that we need to deal with. But the creativity in public finance to do this seems to be so lagging that it's worrisome. Let's take Otuabasi. A quick question. So after his question, all the panelists will probably reflect in 2-minute rounds on the questions and closing thoughts they have, so that we close before 4 o'clock.
Okay, good afternoon. Yeah. Good afternoon, Prof, and thank you for organizing this interesting series and all the experts that are here today. I want to agree with Mr. Chikinwanze, because even the Saudi Aramco, when it listed on the Tadawu, which is Saudi Arabia Exchange, it moved the exchange capitalization to $1 trillion. That's currently it's over a $1 trillion market. So yes, if we leverage the capital markets to list like LNNG and NNPC, even in different compartments, it will really help. But my question is, I'm from the South, like Professor Padu, I'm from Akwa Ibom, and Ecuador has huge gas reserves. Can we look at states having kind of gas ventures where through that state axis, they can even list on the market? Because like Dr. Boniface has said, we shouldn't leave everything on the NNPC and the state company. State governments like the South can even have a gas development venture which can be listed, because South has a huge gas reserve. We've seen initiatives like the Gas Industrial Park in Delta State and even in Bayelsa. So states like Akwa Ibom can also leverage. So just asking about the framework around those possibilities at the state level.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me come back to the panelists this time around. I'll begin with Chief Oyibo. Just general reflections, and if you may respond to some of the questions raised.
Questions, there's some question about Trans-Sahara pipeline.
Yeah.
Even
if it's not Trans-Sahara, perhaps the one running from I think Ajaokuta through Abuja to Kano.
AKK.
Yeah, AKK.
The AKK. AKK had been in the plan for long. Yes, and been in the pipeline for a long time. So it's something that can help develop industries along that route up to the Kano. As for Trans-Sahara pipeline, I don't know because the Algerians have their pipeline straight to Europe. And for me, personally, I thought the pipeline, the West African gas pipeline up to Ghana, we could have extended that even if we have to go to Europe instead of going through the Sahara. Because of security reasons and going through those countries, we may not be able to police that pipeline properly. That's on the Sahara. So I don't know the progress of it. But on the AKK, I know that they are beginning to lay pipelines up to Abuja.
Yeah, oil serve.
Yes. Somebody talked about South, the guy from Akwa Ibom, South. I think the South countries or companies, they should form companies who should be able to partner with the operators, because the operators can develop this gas, even though the government has 49% and has a last say, but government is not going to sit on these resources without development. The operators, I think, should be in a good place to bring a proposal. Government business is to approve. And if you're not asking government to fund, I think, and it's economically viable, I don't see why it should not be approved. Now, to summarize, Babs has already said, I think this thing, how have we managed our gas endowment? That's what we started with. And he has said from good to bad to ugly. I would just say fairly well, but can be much better. And we always have this 30-year cycle of delays. It's not just the gas alone, oil. As I've talked about the PIB, 1999 to 2021 is 22 years. And it's not, we're not sure when they are going to. They keep on changing that. If you ask me now which version there is that they are discussing, I don't know. But they keep on changing the versions. I think recently We heard they went for, the legislators went to Turkey for a retreat on the PIB. So we don't know what they have come out with. As I've said, our gestation period on projects is too long. Once we've decided to go on with a project, let us find the funding, even if it's private funding, and let it go ahead without too much. But each time there's a change of government, they want to change everything. I think that's all I have to comment on.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll turn this to for his you know, the death of industry in Nigeria significantly because initiative that would have impacted Bompai industry in Kano. Speaking to Professor Batnaji 2 or 3 days ago, he is hopeful that Aba is going to be back on track. You know what can happen to Aba if, as he hopes, before the end of this year, that project is now up and running. Manufacturing industries that Aba could have been, you know, blossoming with, that literally have all died, could change just because of that. So, Dr. Hetu. Unmute yourself, please. Dr. Hetu. Yes, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Sonny, you're muted.
Yeah, okay. It's unmuted now. I didn't hear your question. I heard their comments. What was your question? Because I want to address that in my
Well, the question is just your general reflection on everything.
Okay. Now, first of all,
yes,
there's the issue of the PIB. The last version I saw, talked about the PIGB, which includes a provision for allocating 30% to Nigerians. Putting that in the stock market so that Nigerians can buy shares and trade in shares in that particular portfolio. I don't know what it is now. Now, somebody talked about markets not developed. Yes, this is very, very correct. And that is why we are still flaring substantial amount of gas. Because gas is not like, petroleum products where you can buy on the street. Gas development requires long-term contracts. So there must be a customer at the end of the pipeline. Otherwise, that pipeline does not go there. It's not like the nationwide petroleum products pipelines that are run everywhere. Yes. So, in the case of AKK and Trans-Sahara pipeline has been in the plans for more than 20 years. In fact, there was a debate, are we going to do LNG or are we going to do Trans-Sahara in order to reach the European market? At the end of the day, the Trans-Sahara had a lot of politics and a lot of security issues. I think Chambers has already alluded to that. So it was not really an option. And part of the Ajokuta pipeline, that's Oben Ajokuta pipeline, had that in view, that eventually that pipeline might take us, to Kano and across to Niger and to Algeria. But of course, in all these territories, if you are passing, you have to pay fees for, transit fees for all those pipelines. So at the end of the day, it was thought that LNG was safer. You ship, liquefy and ship, and sell to wherever. Europe, we have even sold to Japan. So there was a little bit of more flexibility in that. I was going to address the Charles's summary, which I think there's a little bit of gap that he did not, either he was not aware of or he did not catch. And I think it's a good opportunity to clarify it. The issue, and Charles was a member of the Technical Advisory Committee when I was MD of NLNG. The issue was about contract award and who gets what. That was the issue that divided the board. The issue of technology never arose before then. I just wanted to make that clear. And let me also point out that the LNG Working Committee that selected the TLAC technology reviewed this recommendation. And at the end of the day, Shell recommended APCI. But because of the French shareholding in NLNG, because of Total's shareholding, Total rooted for the French process. And as a compromise, it was said, okay, let us agree, let us accede to them because they are shareholders. But in terms of recommendations, Shell recommended the APCI. So at the end of the day, TLAC technology was selected on commercial basis, not because of superiority. And all the shareholders, including NNPC, agreed. And up to the stage of contract award in 1992, October 6th, to be precise, nobody, and Charles was on the Technical Advisory Committee, nobody talked about technology. So it's a very murky area, and I'm still trying to understand that what went on at that time. But history will show that it was contract award that split that caused the dissolution of the
board.
Yeah.
Because it was, okay. Thank you very much.
Later on, 2 months later, when I met the minister, he now came up with technology. If it was technology, we would have adjusted. There wouldn't have been any reason, any need to go to set the project back 3 years. Anyway, yeah. So it's a long story, and I don't want to. So let us not go there.
I've enjoyed talking about that whole content privately a few times in the past. So,
it's fantastic.
I think it's on this is just away in the audience.
Incredible story. But anyway, Charles, I'm going to finish with you. I'm going to bounce and then finish with you, Charles.
Oh, no problem.
Okay. Yeah. Charles, let me take Babs.
No,
yeah, please go ahead.
Finally, okay, sorry. Finally.
Okay, Babs.
No, finally. Let me land just 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Your question is how have we used this? It is important for us to say it has not all been doom and gloom. We've done a lot of things with gas, the power sector, industries, but the comment I made initially that gas use is driven by the market. If we don't have industries that will take the gas, we cannot just develop gas for the sake of it or use it. And that is why the failure of those other 2 LNG companies was really a disaster because OK LNG and Brass LNG, can you imagine if we had those 2 doing even half of what NLNG is doing? It would have been fantastic. And maybe we will not be flaring Of course, not maybe, we certainly will not be flaring the gas that we are flaring now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, Babs.
All right, thanks, Prof. I think maybe three quick comments for me in terms of summary. I think one, Prof, I would say is that as a country, we still don't yet have, we nearly have like an ideological debate right at the helm of government between private and public sector. It's nearly like a socialism versus capitalism, free market debate that I think is still ongoing. And I think that is part of what sets us back now and again. We start and stop many things because we move from one to the other. And when we look at a lot of our areas of underdevelopment, I think it is where we have tried to go the socialism route, where, for example, we don't want to pay the right price for gas. And if you don't want to pay the right price for gas, nobody invests in the infrastructure, nobody invests in the gas gathering. And so I think there is still there somewhere, I think the Chinese were able to, in the late 80s, come out of this type of debate and were able to then set more clearer national ideology that has helped them to really leapfrog. And I think that remains one of our challenge. Today, you nearly feel sometimes that the private sector and the public sector are not in harmony, they're not working together. It's nearly like a we versus them than a partnership that it should be. I think the second thing you mentioned, I think one or two people have mentioned, you cannot legislate for investors. You cannot use punitive legislation to attract investment. You have to attract investment. And as a country, we are not yet robust in our ways and our approach to attract investors. I think sadly, the window of opportunity is even further closing, as I mentioned, in oil and gas. And people are going to take their money where the best places are. And Nigeria is not the best place right now. Security is not great for us. Our business environment is not great. We don't have, good regulations. Our regulators are very hawkish. So we really have a lot of work to do if we want to attract the investment that we need as a country to really, really develop. And the last point I will make, I think, was to your question around planning, which I thought was very, very important. How do we ring fence some of, things that we come up with as a country and make sure that, from one administration to the other, that continuity continues. And I think that's a deep question that requires thinking. The only thing I could add to that, I think, is that we need to think of how we put into legislation some of the things that we can legislate, because I think, as I mentioned, NLNG Act was one of the ways in which those plans for NLNG were ring-fenced, and it enabled us to be able to make a lot more progress. So I think there's something there around legislating this so that it doesn't matter which government or which political party comes into play, that some of these plans can go for a long-term view, because we need to plan 25 years, 30 years plans for success on a lot of these issues.
Okay, thank you so very much, Babs. Just let's close with you. We started with you, closing with you.
Thank you, Pat. I think it's a privilege, but it is, after many of guys here, so I thought Chamberlain as the chief would do that. But since you've, anyway, we don't have time. No joke. But Pat, let me react to a few of the questions, and then I'll make I'll give my final thoughts. Chike once made a comment about why not list. Yes, I think it's a very valid observation. Why not? Bob said that there's no reason why we shouldn't. But one must note that historically, the federal government of Nigeria approved in 1999 under Absalami the establishment of IJVs. I hope we remember the IJVs, which came up again. Then I retired, proposed it to government. It was approved. Again, I happen to have been there. But 2 weeks or so later, which goes back to what Chike was saying, the group manager of NNPC went to the villa and protested, that he was not consulted. And what happened, just like the case of the gas policy, that approval was reversed. Indeed, Arrett, for those who remember, Arrett's second coming, he was now chased out of office with armed policemen from the office of the minister where he was occupying. So we ran for our lives, you know, and we were accused of smuggling that policy, that proposal into government, into the council. Poor fellow, none of us had access to council. But that's our experience, and it shows the power of the NNPC. So whether it will ever happen or not, I don't know. The future will tell. The second point or question was from Mr. Bonnie-Chizia, Dr. Bonnie-Chizia. He talked about low-hanging fruits and what happens to a hydrocarbon. I don't know. I think there was an illusion whether it's going to become obsolete and all the rest. I think the point I want to make, though, is that from a technical or technological point of view, is to say, well, hydrocarbon or methane, natural gas specifically, is the cheapest, is the most available source. Maybe that's not the cheapest source of hydrogen, which is the alternative energy we are looking at. So if you look at your methane, you have 4 hydrogen where you're able to crack it. Of course, technology is there. So I think there's a market for gas. That's what I think, that there'll be market for gas because it's a transition fuel. Yes, we have the alternative and renewable energy, but today natural gas is a transition fuel to renewables. And because it's the primary source today of hydrogen. So it's something, so I will not despair, but crude oil may suffer the likes of coal, but we'll see. The gentleman from Akwa Ibom asked a question about state venture. I think Chief Oyibo has already addressed it. But to say that there's not any law that I know today that restricts states from getting into developing gas infrastructure or distributing gas within their territory. Indeed, I tell you my experience doing gas link in Lagos, the Lagos state government wanted to be involved, except of course my board was concerned about the political influence of the state in the activity of the company, which is something most people will be concerned about. I know Chief Oyibo said, well, yeah, get some private company. If the structure is right, it may be the right way to go because after all, the state is responsible for urban planning and therefore they must give you the right of way approvals. So it creates an environment for collaboration. So if you are there, maybe you can impress on your governor to take that initiative. Final comment. Well, I think for me, we've talked extensively about policies and politics. I just want to say by closing that it will be important for the future if we start to do policy reviews and appraisals. Our policies are in the book, and I think, unfortunately, we're talking about the gas reinjection decree and some of these laws. In the discussion we had today, I talked about how that law was now redirected in terms of APFA. But that law, as you and I talk today, is also being reviewed. When I say reviewed this time, again, back to what it used to be, because I think people say, wait a minute, we're giving away too much to government, to the investors. But the reality is, until we're able to create a win-win situation in our economic environment, we're not going to have investment and we're going to have development. There's the people who tell you in the industry, well, after God is government. True, God owns everything, but he only gives it to those who take the risk to put their resources in there. And if you don't take risk, if government starts, for me, as government is building the AKK, I really think having government, that's what countries in the early stages of development do. For us, after over 60 years, I think it's a failure of policy to have government as the primary promoter and financier of a major gas pipeline linking Ajaokuta.
Can pay its way.
That can pay its way. By 1992, it was able to pay its way from the economics. And Shell was leading a consortium there to do it. But today, because of our environment, there's no IOC that is interested in developing an infrastructure that will carry its own gas to the major markets they can identify. I mean, after Lagos, the biggest economy or industrial area was Kano. And today, with the demand for power, all that plan of power plants in the north and fertilizer in the middle belt and all of them are still there on paper. But no IOC, no independent investor is partnering with our government. And I think for me, those are serious issues and things we should, as a people and as a nation, spend time to re-examine how we make policies and how we enforce them. I think we need policy review, and we have to ensure always, unless there's a win-win, we ain't going nowhere. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you so very much. I want to thank all our panelists and all the participants. Every day when we go through some of what we've had to come out of these conversations, I actually feel plenty of pain in my heart, head, everywhere, because most of our problems are self-inflicted in Nigeria. Our economy is not where it should be because many people who made choices thinking they were advancing their own personal interests were actually subverting themselves. And this is the tragedy of our reality. My view is that we need a school to train our politicians to at least know what they are going into and the consequences of the choices that they make. J.K. Rowling in the Harry Potter series, I think somewhere said that we are the choices we make, and that is the truth of the matter. Our current situation is a function of the choices that we have made through the years. And the naked truth is that we have hurt ourselves. Even those who thought they were advancing a certain interest will find with the benefit of hindsight that they hurt their own interests. And this is because they didn't have enough knowledge. Babs made the point about it seems to be an ideological thing. It's an ignorance thing, really. Not so much ideological, but ignorance. Because yes, we know that people move sometimes to be socialistic in their orientation. It's not a comment so much on socialism and capitalism sometimes when I look at the consequence. Before the free market took over completely in Singapore, a lot of the government-led initiatives were very effective because they were systematic in approaching problem solving. In our country, unfortunately, we have not. I'm glad that OBS Equesili has this school of public policy and politics or something to help politicians. These were some of the things we try to suggest, that no political party should be without a school that will bring well-trained people, thoughtful people, leaders of society, industry, all of that, to come and talk to people who are trying to enter public life or have been elected. We wouldn't have these things that we have going on if we had such a tradition of having properly cultivated people in public life. But it's work in progress, and I thank you so much for contributing to this process of developing how our country will travel. With this appreciation, I'd like to say in 2 weeks, we'll return on oil and gas still, talking about other aspects of this hugely important area. Yes, Total may say that it's looking at setting down or bringing to zero its crude holdings in Canada 18 years from now. That's their projection. But hydrocarbons will still be here and there are things we can convert them to that will drive progress in our country. The question is how we adapt going forward. Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of the Sunday evening. Thank you.
Pat.
God bless.
God bless. Babs, bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Chief.
Thanks, Chief.
Sonny, thank you very much.
Stay away from those your countrymen, or your pockets will be empty before you come back to Lagos.
Yes, sir. I come with empty pockets, so they don't have much to take.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Thanks. Tom.
Okay, now.
All right, bye.
I've not seen you for a long time.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I have many things to do. Still get on the road.
When hyperacidity threatens to turn your stomach into a raging volcano, reach for Rolox. Rolox Antacid Anti-Flatulence Suspension contains effective ingredients to combat indigestion, heartburn, stomach gas caused by hyperacidity, giving you effective relief. Rolox Antacid Anti-Flatulence Suspension, effective relief against hyperacidity.
Made by SKG Pharma Limited. If symptoms persist after 3 days, consult your doctor.